Hello, everyone, and welcome. I hope you're all well and coping with the challenging demands placed on all of us today, no matter where we're working. The title for our seminar today is Supporting the Teaching Profession During Times of Crisis. I thought you might find it interesting to have a look at the work of the ISTP, the International Summit of the Teaching Profession. I was really fortunate to be able to attend the summit when it took place in Edinburgh a few years ago, and since then have followed this yearly event with interest. It involves ministers for education and representatives from professional organisation and unions of member countries coming together to discuss progress to their previously shared educational goals. It was a fascinating experience. Last year's summit was scheduled to take place in Valencia, Spain. However, given the coronavirus outbreak, it was instead convened virtually by Education International, the OECD, and Spain's Ministry of Education on the 2nd of June 2020. The National Centre of Education and the Economy, the NCEE, President and CEO Anthony Mackay moderated the 2020 summit, which brought together education leaders from government and teachers' associations from 35 leading countries, the 30 highest performing and the 5 fastest improving on the PISA assessment results. I'd like to talk with you today about the report from this conference and provide an opportunity for you to look at the key themes and some of the thinking from across the world represented at the summit. I've put the link to the full report on the PowerPoint. We have seen from our own schools and establishments how individual teachers in all sectors have been taking on responsibilities, coaching and mentoring each other as well as our young people, collaborating, designing online learning environments, becoming innovators of digital learning, taking initiative and becoming so very responsive to change. We also know from our experience that while we have developed remote learning, which has become a lifeline for young people in ways we hadn't imagined a year ago, digital learning doesn't replace the social aspects of in-school learning, and that children and young people really miss their teachers. So this report points us to some of the trends that have been seen in countries around the world and gives us food for thought as we move out of this pandemic context. Globally, educators are considering how to safely and responsibly open schools again, but are also considering the implications of COVID-19, which mean that schools may never look as they did before the pandemic. However, even before the pandemic, we were thinking about the changing nature of face-to-face learning, the environments and the discussions that we had about what the future of education should look like. The NCEE, who are the joint authors of this report, has been thoroughly exploring how high-performing education systems have adapted to distance learning and how they are thinking long-term about future education redesign. 4 key themes emerged from the discussion. Firstly, high-quality, mutually respectful collaboration between governments and the teaching profession has been essential to respond to the pandemic. There have been many promising innovations that have emerged in response to the need for distance learning, but the pandemic has also reinforced the value of in-school learning. Thirdly, teacher collaboration has become even more essential as teachers have been forced to transition to unfamiliar virtual learning spaces, and policies to enable teachers to work together as professionals will be crucial. And most importantly, the pandemic has exposed long-standing inequities in education to a degree that has been eye-opening for us all, and systems must adapt to become more inclusive and equitable moving forward. The report summarises key takeaways from the 3-hour discussion, and in addition, short case studies are available to indicate what several of the participating countries have done to promote teacher professionalism and the role their professional organisation have played, which is in essence the core work of ISTP. As the host of the summit, Minister Celaá from Spain pointed to 5 specific lessons Spain's education system had learned in the wake of the pandemic. Despite new possibilities for distance learning, in-person schools are irreplaceable and provide a unique environment for students to communally develop the necessary skills to thrive in life. Secondly, despite unprecedented investments, too many children still lack consistent digital access, and more work remains to be done. Similarly, systems need to invest more in teachers' digital skills and developing their knowledge and comfort level when using technology in teaching. How do we move into true digital pedagogy? Rigid and outdated ways of organising schooling were impeding progress, and systems needed to do more to enable adaptability. And finally, systems should never lose sight of inclusivity and equity as both the goal and the method. I'm sure by now you will have seen the work that's taken place in Scotland, What Scotland Learned, that was published quite recently. And so let's take time to stop and think, what does this mean for us? Let's look at some of the questions on where the Spanish perspective might align with our own thinking. What features of this learning resonate with our discoveries in Scotland? What lessons have we learned here? What opportunities could we seize from our learning? And what do these lessons mean for us as we develop more equitable systems? And so I'm going to give you 15 minutes to work through a protocol called What, So What, Now What, to hopefully scaffold your thinking on this over the next 15 minutes, either in breakout rooms if you're doing this digitally, or in your groups if you're chatting to each other. Please move into your groups and identify one person who will record your discussion to feed back to your main discussion in 15 minutes. Thank you. And so now that you're back from your discussion, and hopefully I've had time to think about where we are in Scotland in relation to those questions above and the lessons that we have learned, let's look again at the summit. Andrea Schleicher talked at the summit about seeing change often coming out of times of real crisis and posed the notion that perhaps we should consider what schooling might look like post-pandemic. This was very similar to the work we discussed from Dr. Simon Breakspear in Seminar 1, where we looked at the opportunities this pandemic working may bring. Michael Fullan also talks about the alienation of significant numbers of students from the way schools have previously operated and asks, is this the time to look carefully at change? 1.5 billion students have been locked out of schools around the world, and we have found out that education systems are not as resilient as we might have thought we were. In Schleicher's view, distance learning can and must work better in future. We also saw from some of the work that's been done in international comparisons that some systems were able to mobilize very quickly to have children learning remotely when the pandemic hit. China, for instance. In China, 50 million students within 1 month of schools closing were all online, working away and learning successfully. So there are some lessons for us to look at around the world. Andrea Schleicher urged participants to consider the possibility that school doesn't just get back to business as usual when a vaccine is developed. He made it very clear that distance learning had uncovered many inequities in education, very much in line with what we know in Scotland. Students lack consistent and equitable access to broadband, and systems have not done enough to support all teachers to teach using technology and to elevate the practice of the most experienced teachers so that they reach the most challenging class groups, but that there were real indications around the world of progress being made. This is Education International's President, Susan Hopgood, and she entered a note of caution. Her comments on the slide concluded that we must be wary of many stakeholders who are in favour of disrupting traditional forms of education as an attempt to use distant learning as a rationale to defund education systems. In her view, more funding was necessary to support vulnerable students at risk of losing a year of learning and to enhance teacher professionalism and capacity to respond to the unprecedented challenges in the wake of the pandemic. And so how do we in Scotland ensure that we both make positive, significant progress coming out of the pandemic to influence future practice, and at the same time not disrupt our system too dramatically to impact most on our vulnerable children and families who could be most at risk? Here are a couple of quotes from the report that we're going to use for a protocol called PMI. As you can see on this slide, conflicting viewpoints were expressed about future changes in education. Please take some time before we go into the protocol work to read through both of these boxes carefully. This is a critical debate to influence and shape thinking as we go through this school year, and one we should take the opportunity to explore. What is best for our system in Scotland, our schools, and our young people? The protocol, called PMI, will, as you see from the online facilitation notes, allow you to consider the points made in the previous two slides, make brief notes on the key points, and take turns around a breakout group or a discussion group while recording what you're thinking. So please say what you liked, what was positive from the messages. What were the minuses? What concerned you about it? And what did you find interesting or intriguing? And most importantly, what of that work is particularly connected to our work? This protocol should take about 15 minutes in groups of perhaps 3 or 4 people to carry through, and is an interesting way to look at a document, a video, or a report. Thank you. And now, here we are back in the final slide of this presentation, with the summit coming to an end with closing remarks by Andrea Schleicher, who acknowledged that while there was much optimism in the room about positive creative innovations in the wake of the pandemic, there was also a shared acknowledgement on the reality of these challenges. All recognised that despite their best efforts, the quality of students' distance learning experiences had varied widely. As Schleicher noted in his closing remarks, inclusion is now the central challenge in education. Harnessed properly, technology can promote inclusion, but there is also a risk of leaving some groups of students behind if technology is not used well. These points were echoed by Education International's David Edwards, who called for using the pandemic as an opportunity to rebuild education systems for equity, and to do so with humility and an understanding of all that we do not know. Thank you. I hope you found that bit of thinking around the ISTP helpful and useful. And so there are a couple of slides following on with further information for you to use. This slide has a hyperlink to the OECD podcasts and all of the education reports, both around coronavirus, but on other areas. And this slide will take you also to the NCE report, and the PowerPoint from today is available on the recording site. There is also a link to the Education International report, and you'll see that on the slide. Thank you very much for joining us today.